All right. Excellent. Okay, great. Well, yeah, good morning, everybody. Welcome to today's Consciousness Club. Thanks for coming along to the last Consciousness Club of the term before the Christmas break. So it's a real pleasure today to have JohnDorsch as our guest speaker. So John was, until very recently, a PhD student and staff member in the philosophy department at the University of Edinburgh, where he did his PhD focusing on the philosophy of cognitive science, the philosophy of psychology, and his PhD thesis examined, well, you'll hear about it in the talk today, examined the role of metacognitive feelings in cognition, and focused on the extent to which these feelings depend on interoception, so the role of embodiment and bodily feelings in meta-representational capacities and capacities for self-knowledge more broadly. And that's how I got to know John earlier in the year when we were at the same meeting together on metacognition. And now we just found out just 2 minutes ago that we all need to congratulate John on his new job in Munich with Ophelia de Roy there. And so we'll be, excited to see what you do next. And I guess today we're very glad to have you here to talk about your PhD work. So why don't you take it away, John, and the floor is yours.
Okay, great. Thanks so much for the introduction, Steve, and thank you everyone for being here, and thanks for inviting me to give this talk. I'm very excited to share all this research with you and get everybody's input. So I'm really looking forward to the questions at the end. So I'm gonna go ahead and share my screen, and hopefully this works okay here. So let's see. Okay, so it says it's paused currently. If I hit resume share, how's that? Does that look okay? Or is there boxes in the way?
That's not a good.
Okay.
It's like very much zoomed in. I think maybe just stop share. Oh, there we go. There you go.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, looking good.
Okay, and then I got another message that people are in the waiting room, and there's the little box.
Don't worry about that.
Don't
worry about that. We'll handle that.
Okay. Okay, everyone. So a little bit of technical difficulties after so many years of COVID, and everything. We all still are novices when it comes to like using this technology. It's so funny. So as you can see from the title of my talk, it's entitled "Knowing Ourselves Through Embodied Entanglement." And this is a direct play on the paper that Cecilia Hayes in this lab put out about a year ago now, Knowing Ourselves Together, the Cultural Origins of Metacognition. And so what this is sort of a complement to all that research that's been put out by your lab and by Cecilia Hayes' work primarily. And the subtitle here is The Role of Embodied Confidence on the Path of Acquiring Self-Knowledge. So what I am going to argue today and try and convince you of is that embodied confidence plays a really important role in explaining how we came to be the kinds of creatures that we are, that know ourselves in these really interesting ways that we do. Okay, and I just want to say that most of this research was done at the University of Edinburgh during my PhD, and the core of what I'm arguing here has been accepted for publication. I just got accepted about 2 weeks ago in philosophical psychology, so I'm very excited about that. And a lot of it I'm still working on, and I want to get published. Okay, so just a little bit of caveats there. So the purpose of this talk is to argue for these embodied expressions of confidence as these very plausible candidates for bridging a gap between two origin stories about metacognition, which I'm sure everyone here is familiar with, but I will go into details in case there's people that would like a review. On the one hand, you have a story about meta representation, and on the other hand, you have a story about meta memory and controlling and predictive processes that have this sort of metacognitive feature to them, and sort of bridging those two together, right? Saying that embodied confidence plays an important role there. So the chief concern in that debate about bridging the two together is really about whether the evaluative species of metacognition, the one that we likely share with non-human animals, whether that is cognitively robust enough to sort of lay the foundation for the meta-representational kind, which is commonly called mind reading. And I'm going to claim that Bayesian theories of metacognition, they do have the tools to explain the origin and fill in that gap, but they really ought to appeal to embodied expressions of confidence and uncertainty. Okay, so just a quick breakdown. We're first going to talk about what I mean by self-knowledge. And section 2, I'll go over the 2 accounts of metacognition. All of this should just be review for most of you. And then 3, 4, 5, and 6 is where I sort of get into the nitty-gritty details. 3, I look at evaluated metacognition and noetic feelings. What I'm saying is that embodied expressions of confidence are expressions of noetic feelings. And then we'll look at the current models of noetic feelings. I find them mostly lacking. And then I'm going to build the case for an embodied account of metacognition, an embodied account of noetic feelings. And I'm going to talk in section 6 about how an embodied account will help us bridge the gap between these 2 forms of metacognition. Okay, so just to get all my cards out on the table, let's just talk real quick about what I mean by self-knowledge. So that way everyone understands what my target is, what I'm ultimately trying to explain. So I take a little bit of inspiration from Steve Fleming's book, how he begins with, I think it's a great way to begin, so sorry if I'm sort of stealing your thunder here. But we all know about the Temple of Delphi and how it was etched this phrase like, know thyself, right? And we also know that Socrates popularized this to mean that each one of us has this duty to adopt a critical stance toward our own beliefs. And someone who has a PhD in philosophy, you can trust me when I say that the essence of Socratic philosophy is, ought I to believe the things I believe? So this species of self-knowledge that I'm interested in, where we reflect and we consider our beliefs, whether they're true or false, whether we have justification to believe what we believe, it is as epistemological as it is ethical, right? Because it is about whether we ought to believe, whether we're right to believe what we believe. And this ethical consideration behind self-knowledge is what really lends itself to all the social dimensions that are talked about in the cultural origin hypothesis. So we'll talk a little bit more about that later. Okay, so this capacity to seek out justification for belief, this can only be possible if we're able to form beliefs as beliefs, right? Beliefs are these things that they're about the world, and they can either be true or false, and they admit of various degrees of justification. And we can only acquire beliefs about beliefs as beliefs if we have this meta-representational form of metacognition, right? Where we represent representations as representations. Hopefully a lot of this is sort of bread and butter for everybody here. And I don't need to go into any more detail, but if you have any more questions about this, I'm happy to go into later in the Q&A. So the question I'm asking is, ultimately, how did we acquire this capacity to acquire beliefs about beliefs? How did we acquire meta-representational metacognition? And so I just have some assumptions here, really basic ones that I think we all should buy into, but as a philosopher, I love to sort of tell everybody what my assumptions are, make everything nice and neat. So I assume that we have the capacity to understand the question, what are the origins of self-knowledge? I assume that it admits of a natural scientific answer, that we don't learn about it through revelation. I assume that we can therefore turn to the sciences of the brain and behavior to determine it. Good, so that's what I've done in my PhD thesis, is I've looked at the sciences of the brain and behavior in order to come up with an answer to this very philosophical question. When you do that, when you turn to the sciences of brain and behavior, you get, in truth, at least, that's my PI, so excuse me, everything's fine. In truth, we have at least 2 distinct origin stories, and it's not at all clear how these 2 stories can be reconciled, right? We have one story that comes out of comparative psychology, we're looking at non-human animals and human cognition, and we have another story that largely comes out of developmental psychology, which I'll get into in a minute, and it's not clear how to get those 2 together. Right, so on the one hand, we have the developmental psychology origin story, and it says something along the lines of these meta-representational capacities emerged at some point in time during our development, and they're enriched by enculturation, and they even progress long into it. The slide here ends with adolescence, but as we're finding out now in common research is that this actually continues on well into adulthood. And then there's another origin story coming out of comparative psychology that talks of using uncertainty monitoring tests and says that here's another way that we get metacognition, we get meta-representational metacognition. So the question that a lot of people are asking, are these stories, are they distinct? Are they different? They're different kinds of metacognition, obviously. But can we somehow fit them together? Is it the case that the evaluative sort that we share with non-human animals, did it lay the ground for the meta-representational sort that develops in childhood? Is there some way of bridging these two stories together? And when I talk to a lot of people, like I've talked to Steve about this, I've talked to Nick Shea about this, I've talked to Ophelia, my PI, about this, everyone seems to say that, yeah, there's got to be some way of bridging the two together, but everyone has sort of various degrees about how significant the older evolutionary system plays in the much more newer meta-representational system. And I think the reason why there's so much diverging views and confusion and vagueness about how to fit the two together is just is because there hasn't been a lot of research done on exactly that middle ground on one hand. And on the other hand, I think it's also, the research is bereft of an understanding of evaluative metacognition that lacks its embodied contribution. And I think that that's a big piece of the puzzle that is missing. And so what I want to do is just add that piece of the puzzle. And I think it does help us make sense of the bridge. Okay, so before I talk about that, let's just quickly go over the two dominant accounts of metacognition. Something that I think should be a review for a lot of people. So as I'm sure a lot of you know, on the one hand, coming out of developmental psychology, we have mind reading or meta-representational metacognition. It goes by several names. Many of them you can see here on the screen: System 2, metacognition, explicit metacognition, attributive metacognition, or just theory of mind. And what I take as my starting point is the cultural origins hypothesis. So there's another contending hypothesis about how it's innate, and I just set that aside in my thinking and also in my PhD thesis, and I take this on board. So many of you are probably really happy to hear that that I've done that. And yeah, so the evidence, as I'm sure a lot of you know, comes from cross-cultural analysis, where you look at different cultures and you see that the way that mind reading capacities sort of develop very differently depending on how those cultures understand belief statements and how they talk about beliefs. For example, in a Japanese culture, it's not as common to talk about one's beliefs. And so we see these capacities develop a little later and in different ways. And so we can sort of play around with the cultural levers, and we see that meta-representational capacities come out in slightly different ways at different times in a child's development. And that tells us that there are these cultural pressures there that sort of bring mind reading to life. So I'm accepting that as the origin story coming out of developmental psychology. Yes, just referencing the paper here from Nick Shea and in the lab here with respect to the cultural origins hypothesis, communicating these metacognitive representations across two or more people. Good, and so the idea then is that self-knowledge is just learning to take those capacities that we've acquired from our culture and our society, from our parents, and turn them onto ourselves. Sometimes it's called self-directed meta-representation or self-directed mind reading. It's this ability to read our own minds through these cognitive gadgets that we've acquired by our society, much like learning to read books. Okay, so the other story coming out of comparative psychology is based in evaluative metacognition. And I should quickly say that it's not just comparative psychology. To the degree that one will argue that evaluative metacognition lays the foundation for advanced capacities and explains human intelligence, the evidence is largely drawn on from non-human animal studies in comparative psychology. And there you see that I call it evaluative metacognition, but it goes by different names. System 1, procedural experience-based is Coriat's term, implicit metacognition versus explicit. Sometimes it's just called meta-memory, right? These studies go back to the 1960s. Hart's famous studies with the tip of the tongue experience and things like that. And here you can see another paper where you have the image of just the one person's skull. And you see that's a very sort of different form of internal cognitive control monitoring sort of processes. We'll get into the details in a minute. Okay, so evaluative metacognition, it has its roots in cybernetics. That's something that I think is often sort of overlooked when people talk about this form of metacognition. It's about actions being enabled by predicting sensory outcomes. And those predictions are compared to sensory consequences, and then it generates some kind of feedback. And that feedback is then, and it informs the system about the success of the action, and that's used to update internal models. And this goes way back to the early days in cybernetics in the 1960s and 70s, long before we had the Bayesian brain hypothesis and predictive coding architectures. So real quick, I just want to go over the evidence coming out of comparative psychology. Some of you may be very familiar with the uncertainty monitoring tests. Just want to quickly, this is the sort of how the cross-cultural studies are evidence for adopting the cultural origins hypothesis. The uncertainty monitoring tests are the evidence for adopting this phylogenetic origin story. So what you have here is on the right, you see dots tasks. Below there's a lines task. I'm just going to concentrate on the dots for now. You're given a force perceptual discrimination task where you have to decide, which of the two blocks are the denser blocks. And you have two buttons to press, one for the one on the left and one on the right. And with this particular task, it might be quite easy. It seems like the one on the left is right, so we press the one on the left. But you can easily imagine that if we add more and more dots to the one on the right, eventually this will become very difficult to do. If not impossible, we can make it an equal number, and then you're guaranteed to be wrong. And so what we'll do is we'll add in another trial with a third option, an opt-out trial, where you can decide, this is too difficult for me to determine, and you press the I don't know button, the opt-out button. And of course, in trials like this, you'll see performance increase for those cases where you don't know, right? And the interesting thing is when we give this task to non-human animals and we see how well they perform, right? The question is, do they also use the opt-out button like you and I use? And so here's just one of the classic studies from 2003. It's one of my favorite graphs of all time. These graphs show the use of the opt-out button. Concentrate on B, C, and D. B, you have human participants, and C and D, you have two non-human animals, two apes, and Abel and Baker. And you can focus on the middle here that I've highlighted, where it becomes difficult to know whether it's sparse or it's dense. And you can see the use of the opt-out button greatly increasing. And then if you compare the use of the opt-out button between humans and non-human animals, you see very similar usage. And this leads us to believe that the animals, just like us humans, are pressing that button when they don't know. So there's a way in which they know when they don't know. So goes the original sort of thinking coming out of these studies. And of course, people have been skeptical, and we as a community have been doing these studies with non-human animals for well over a couple decades now. And there's a lot of interesting results that have come out of it. And I won't bother going into the details. I'm happy to in the Q&A if you want. But the gist of it is that the animals we see in the green box come out really well. So humans, we have the old world monkeys, capuchin monkeys, dolphins, and birds. It's a Western scrub jay. And the animals that we see in this the yellow box, there's mixed results. And I was going to talk to you about the ways that we can tease out metacognitive capacities in these various types of animals. There's 3 different sort of groups, but I'm going to skip it for now, just for the sake of time. And if you want to know more about these very interesting studies, I'm happy to talk about them. But yeah, the moral of the story is there is some really interesting difference in the animal kingdom about whether or not you can respond in these metacognitive ways about your mental states, and whether you know or you don't know, and you can opt out to increase performance. Okay, so that's the evidence saying that there's something here in terms of self-knowledge capacities. But we can't forget the goal, right? We can't forget what we're ultimately trying to explain with metacognition, regardless of whether it's meta-representational or it's evaluative metacognition. Human creativity. That's ultimately our goal. And with meta-representational metacognition, I don't think anyone is confused there about whether this plays an important role. This ability to represent mental representations as mental representations, beliefs as beliefs, that clearly is sophisticated and important in explaining how we human beings are the kinds of creatures that we are. But when it comes to evaluated metacognition, it's far less clear whether this is really playing a fundamental role, right? Controlling, monitoring, and evaluating cognitive operations in order to mitigate uncertainty and to achieve more adaptive performance in an uncertain environment. This begins to sound a lot like the Bayesian brain hypothesis, where you have prior beliefs that are updated in light of current sensory evidence and generates a posterior belief for the purpose of adaptive behavior. And now with predictive coding and predictive processing frameworks that give us a great deal of nuance when it comes to how exactly these models are formed and how the predictions are updated and what the prediction errors are and how well that's implemented in the brain. It's beginning to sound like the cybernetic story of the 1960s and 70s is this sort of antiquated architecture that we've inherited, only to find out that is just the business of the brain. That the business of cognition just is controlling, monitoring, and evaluating cognitive operations. That cognition just is metacognition through and through. And if so, there's very little meta about this form of metacognition, right? Or it's all meta, in which case the word meta doesn't mean much anymore. So that is a problem. I call it, in my PhD thesis, I call it the problem of triviality, because it makes this what originally was believed to be some fascinating ingredient to explain the origins of human intelligence. It turns out to be this sort of trivial thing that all brains do. Okay, so the question that everyone is sort of asking now is, can evaluated metacognition, can it really help explain the origins of self-knowledge? And the answer is, I think it can, but I think we need to augment evaluated metacognition to be embodied metacognition. And this provides a layer of sophistication to it, where it's not subjected to this sort of triviality issue. And it also helps bridge to the cultural origins hypothesis. Okay, so let's talk about evaluated metacognition. And the crux of making this work are noetic feelings. We have to face up to noetic feelings and really confront what they are, how are they produced, how are they different from simple error signals. And that's what I'm going to sort of give to you today, is developed understanding of noetic feelings and how that fits. So if you ask one of my favorite philosophers of all time, Joël Proust, whose work on metacognition and noetic feelings is by far the most vast of any researchers that I've ever come across, to talk to you about metacognitive feelings or epistemic feelings or noetic feelings. They all go by different names. It's basically the same thing. She will give you something like this, right? Here's a clip from YouTube. It's been uploaded to YouTube. It's a talk that she gave in 2021 for her paper Striving and Doing, where she's explaining, you can see metacognitive feeling here on the right-hand side. And we have a comparator. There's some kind of observed feedback, some expected feedback. There's some kind of stored heuristics, a model, right? And then some error gets generated, and that produces a metacognitive feeling, which has a valence and intensity. But if you look at all of this, this is just the cybernetic story once again, right? There's nothing any more fundamentally different than the cybernetic story. And you can see that there's no appeal to any kind of extracerebral bodily interoceptive components. And when we look at noetic feelings like that, it becomes very difficult to tell whether there's any difference between just a simple old error signal and a control loop versus noetic feelings. They just, if going back here, it just basically looks like the exact same thing. And I think that this conception of noetic feelings limits us in understanding what important role they play. So we need to smash that apart and actually consider how noetic feelings can be quite different from simple error signals. So noetic feelings, they've been called metacognitive feelings, epistemic emotions. I choose noetic feelings. Why do I choose to call it that? I just think it's the least loaded in terms of what it sort of implies. Because I get it from Tulving, who was one of the first researchers to sort of come across noetic feelings. In 1972, he set his celebrated memory studies for the distinction between semantic and episodic memory. So he has these really basic studies that he did where he'd give people a list of words to memorize. And then he would ask them, he would show them one of the words and say, do you remember this word? And they would have two different responses. Either they would remember themselves sitting in the chair learning the word, an episode, or they would just look at the word and go, yeah, that looks familiar. I know that word. And so this for him was it's been tested again and again. And it turns out like to be a pretty robust distinction in memory, though the contemporary research is questioning whether that's the right way of making sense of memory. But the general consensus is there's something like this going on where we have a way of remembering episodes of our lives and ways of just remembering information. And so when we have these feelings associated with just remembering information, they're noetic, they're knowing feelings, we know the information. And then we have these feelings that are associated with our own personal experience. They're autonoetic because we remember ourselves, being in Disney World when we were a kid or whatever it is. And they come from episodic memory. And then he also distinguished anoetic feelings that just come straight from the body. But as you are probably expecting, hopefully, I don't think that that's the right way of, I think they're all coming from the extracerebral body. And so that's not a really useful distinction. Okay, but there you go. You can see where I'm getting the term noetic feelings from memory, meta-memory, just like evaluated metacognition. Okay, so let's just introduce you to, in case you're still wondering what noetic feelings are, let's just quickly introduce you to them. I want you to try and have a noetic feeling here during my talk. So one way that we can do this is just like with Tolving's experiments, is I can present you with a famous face here, the paleontologist from Dr. Alan Grant from Jurassic Park. And I'm sure many of you have seen Jurassic Park. If you haven't, it's a classic. And you look at that face and you go, oh, I know that guy. So there are three different ways this could go. You could actually know the actor's name. That's not very interesting. You could have absolutely no idea who that is because you've never seen Jurassic Park. That's also not interesting. It's the middle of the road that is interesting, where you recognize his face, you have this feeling of familiarity, this feeling that you know the name, but you can't quite place it. You might have this tip of the tongue experience. And those types of sensations are noetic feelings, right? They're about that semantic memory, that knowledge of the person's name. And by the way, his name is Sam Neill, in case anyone had the tip of the tongue experience and they're feeling very frustrated. Okay, so the tip of the tongue experience, you can see the research going back 1965, and it goes on in 2018. It's still a mystery, and it's still a lot of opportunities for research. What exactly these things are, like where do they come from? How do they work? What do they mean? How to make sense of them philosophically? Okay, yeah, feeling of knowing. Another one that I think is really interesting is the aha moment, sometimes called the eureka moment. And we can also generate these in the lab. These come out of the Chicago lab. Compound associate word problems. So there's a list of like 144 of these things. And I used to have a lot of slides with a bunch of them because I think it's fun. But I just have one for you today, where you have three different nouns: pie, tree, crab. And your job is to find a noun, a fourth noun, that will build a compound with each one of them. And it doesn't matter the order. And so you can look at that and it can just hit you, right? Like, oh, apple, right? Apple pie, apple tree, crab apple. This can be a bit of a struggle for non-native speakers of English because of crab apple. Not many people know it. A crab apple, for those people who don't know, is the kind of sour apples that you feed to horses, for example. And there are two ways of solving this kind of problem. You can either go through like a mental dictionary in your head and take every word and sort of compare and do analysis to define the right answer, or you could go about it very quickly through a process that is referred to as insight in the literature, where it just hits you suddenly. And when it hits you suddenly, you have an aha experience. So that is an example of a feeling of knowing, of a noetic feeling. And so I just want to make it, hopefully I've made it clear to you now that noetic feelings are with us all the time. They're there when we're solving problems. They're there when we're making decisions. And I think most importantly, they're there when we feel confident and we feel certain. And they're also there when we do not feel confident, when the lack thereof, when we feel quite a cognitive dissonance and confused. Right. So noetic feelings are ubiquitous in our lives and the kinds of agents that we are. So let's take a look at, now that we understand noetic feelings, let's take a look at the current models. And I'm very critical of current models because they are very traditionalist. And by traditionalist, what I mean is that Susan Hurley, one of my favorite philosophers, described traditional cognition as this sandwich model of cognition, where you just have perception on the one hand and action on the other hand, and in the middle, in the meat of the sandwich is cognition. And perception is just implying an input, and action is just the output, and cognition does some kind of problem solving, some inferential statistics or something. And perception and action are nothing but inputs and outputs. They don't actually do any of the interesting work themselves. All the interesting cognitive work is done in the brain. It's done in the sort of central processor. And in this, taking this sort of traditional cognition approach to noetic feelings, we get the result that the brain is capable of producing noetic feelings without the support of any bodily process or any bodily information. So if we go back to these cybernetic models that explain metacognitive feelings, you can see all of that. You can see that there's no bodily processes being appealed to here. Metacognitive feelings are just the feedback signals generated by cognitive comparators. And so the central control structures are realized by neuronal populations in the brain that produce internal feedback signals for calibrating internal models, motivating behavior without any recourse to any bodily process. And again, this sort of goes back to that problem I highlighted earlier, where it just seems like cognition is just metacognition through and through. Now, there are ways of responding to this. So this problem that I'm raising, I'd call it the problem of triviality. One of my favorite responses comes from Mayneal and colleagues, where they talk about how, well, look, John, it's more complex. They would say to me, look, it's more complex than that. You know, we have distributional, sort of a Bayesian sort of precision estimation going on nested in the brain, and there are specific neural circuits that take that as a kind of input, and it generates a scalar representation of summary confidence. And sometimes that summary confidence is then accessed by the subject in order to report their confidence levels. And when that happens, it's broadcast globally. They have like a global broadcast theory of consciousness that communicates this Bayesian sort of confidence in the form of a scalar representation that we report on. And so that seems like it's sophisticated enough, a scalar representation to avoid this problem. There are other ways of possibly avoiding the problem that appeals to domain general metacognitive feedback signals. And yeah, these are ways of avoiding this problem of triviality. I'm no denying that, there's no denying that there. But what is important is that these are still traditional cognitive theories that just look at cognition as this sandwich, and that just the meat in the middle, and the body is just perceived as giving input. It's not doing anything too terribly interesting. And I think that is holding us up from understanding the important role that noetic feelings and embodied cognition plays in explaining the origins of self-knowledge. So we're also starting to lose sight of explaining these origins when we go about it this round. We solved the problem of triviality, but we haven't really solved the problem of the origin of self-knowledge. Why is that? Because it's really unclear how a scalar representation of confidence or domain general meta-representational signal, how it can explain the emergence of mind reading capacities, right? If we agree with the cultural origins hypothesis, how does a domain general signal help explain that cultural practice of mind reading? How does it? That's still a mystery. And I think that mystery can shed some light on that mystery when we appeal to the embodiment of metacognition. Okay, hopefully that is clear. Hopefully I've made all of that clear to everybody, because now I'm going to start building the case. Hopefully, the problem is now clear. Now I'm going to start building a solution. So the case for embodied metacognition. So the first thing that I have to do is I have to convince you that noetic feelings are embodied. Because right now, the status quo, the current research says, nope, it's all just generated in the brain. It's just a feedback signal, nothing more than that. So I want to change your mind about that. So I'm going to argue for a common mechanism between interception and evaluative metacognition, and I'll be drawing on empirical evidence on the role of interception in metacognition. And here we'll see that the production of noetic feelings depends upon an intricate interface between the brain and the body. And what ultimately is going on is this metacognitive processing going on in sort of the cybernetic architecture of the mind is being made salient through the interception of bodily efferents. So what I mean by made salient, that's my phrase for getting out of trouble when it comes to talking about consciousness. So you can plug in your favorite origin story of consciousness, if it's global broadcast theory, if it's a higher order thought theory, just plug it in right there for made salient, and I'm happy with it. I'm not committed to any particular notion of consciousness. But the idea is that made salient becomes accessible to the subject by which they could, if they have the capacity to report on it, things like that. Okay, so what I'm putting forward is neo-Jamesian, in the spirit of William James, a neo-Jamesian theory about noetic feelings. So essentially that what you feel when you feel a noetic feeling are bodily changes. And this brain-body relationship, it obtains due to bodily changes being indexed to changes in metacognitive processing fluency. So I'll just go over that again. So you have the bodily bits, and these somehow, through this interesting interface, come to represent metacognitive processing changes. And instead of saying represent, because that's a very loaded term, I use the word index because it's a very sort of minimal understanding of representation, not like the kind where you represent representations as representations. Indexing just means informational correlations, strong informational correlations between what is doing the representing, the body, and what is being represented, the brain, to make it really simple, the body and the brain. Okay, we can talk about that more later if you have questions. So let's go ahead and start with some of these studies, right? One of them, I think it's quite funny. It's got a great title, Remembering by the Seat of Your Pants, Goldinger and Hazen from 2005. What they showed was that subliminal buzzing will enhance feelings of familiarity. And the buzz, interestingly enough, not only increased confidence in false alarms, but it reduced confidence in true positives. So here's the setup of this experiment. So you would give somebody a task like this. Do you know this man? And then you would surreptitiously put a sort of a subwoofer underneath their chair, and you would have it buzz at a subliminal level, so they don't know. And what they would find is that you would say no if it was familiar, and you would say yes if it's not familiar. It would mess with your ability to have a noetic feeling that targets the correct semantic information. And interestingly enough, Micha Allen and his group, they had a test, an experiment in 2016 that is very similar to this one. And here what they did is they had mass discussed cues in advance of a discrimination task, and they saw very similar results. So more or less what's going on here would be something like this. Do you know this man? And then I have a discuss cue, but it's subliminal. So just, it flashes so quickly, of course, that the brain processes it, but you're not conscious of it. And then you would get something like this. You would say you're less confident that you know this man if the image is visually precise, but you would be more confident that you know this man if it's visually noisy, right? Strange results, right? And Allen and colleagues explained this inverted relationship by appealing to the Bayesian brain hypothesis and in predictive coding architectures, and saying that the unexpected arousal, what it's doing is it's counteracting this influence of cognitive processing biases, hyperpriors. And these are well nested within the cognitive hierarchy, and they modulate the influence of sensory information experience. So if we take that theory and we try to explain noetic feelings, we get something kind of like this. What Goldinger and Hansen's study was showing is that the subliminal buzzing underneath my chair, it counteracts priors about mnemonic processing. Higher fluency indicates an unfamiliar stimulus, in lower fluency indicates a familiar stimulus. And Allen and others, this group, they say that this way of thinking and this evidence, it motivates a revised view of metacognition as incorporating priors about physiological states and sensory inputs, right? So the body is in this the whole time in the way that it's using physiological priors about physiological states in determining the metacognitive information related to confidence, familiarity, all the noetic feeling stuff. Okay, but quickly skip that slide. There's still a problem here. It's unclear whether the interception of bodily efference is really explaining how the metacognitive signals become salient to the subject. So you have some metacognitive signal, it's telling you it's familiar, it's not familiar. That's being hijacked in some kind of interesting way with bodily information, and sort of the opposite is sort of happening. But when I make a judgment that this is familiar or not familiar, that information that I'm using, am I learning about that information through a bodily efferent, or am I learning about that directly, as it were, through the feedback in some cognitive architecture? So do bodily efferents tell us that something is familiar? So the crucial question is, do some metacognitive fluency signals become salient to the subject through the interception of bodily efferents? So Kohler's lab investigated this question. They have two papers that have come out that I think give us some pretty good evidence that in some cases we do. So here's more or less how this works for one study. Here we have, do you know this man? And this man you'll say he'll look familiar. So if you don't know who he is, it doesn't really matter. If you do know who he is, Jeff Daniels, right? It's the middle ground that we're interested in. So you're more likely to say that he looks familiar if his face is presented to you on heartbeat, right, systole, rather than off heartbeat. So if I present this to you, boom, right on your heartbeat, you're more likely to say it looks familiar in those cases than if it's presented off heartbeat. So this only holds for the no response with the noetic feeling of knowing, as opposed to the remember response with episodic memory. So this is really targeting semantic memory. It's really targeting noetic feelings. Okay, the next study from 2017, it measured cardiovascular changes while subjects provided feelings of knowing. And the way that this worked was, I would then ask you, well, how familiar does he look, right? And the strength that you would give, you'd say, oh, on a scale of 1 to 10, 10 being the highest, that this will correlate with greater heart rate acceleration, right? And interestingly enough, that correlation between increased heart rate and higher ratings was modulated by how interceptively sensitive you are. So they would do this Chandry's heartbeat task to see like how good you are at like feeling your own heartbeat. And that allowed them to sort of scale their subjects in terms of how sensitive they are to their bodily efferents. And the more sensitive they were to their bodily efferents, the greater this correlation, the greater the correlation. Okay, so the noetic feeling, the degree of arousal effectively correlates with the degree of heart rate acceleration, and it's modulated by our ability to sense interceptive signals. And this suggests that to the extent that participants can tune into their visceral feedback, these autonomic signals shape their judgments. And I think this is saying a lot. So I think the first study says noetic feelings correlate with the production of cardiovascular efferents. And the second study shows that the degree of arousal is a function of heart rate and the degree to which subjects can sense their efferents. And these really motivate this neo-Jamesian theory about noetic feelings, that what you feel when you feel a noetic feeling are bodily changes that are indexed to this cardiovascular activity. So what we need, though, is we need a proposal for how these bodily efferents can convey these degrees of fluency. And what I've come up with, what I hypothesize, is very simply that degrees of bodily arousal will index degrees of fluency, while the valence will index whether it's fluently or not fluently processed. So it's just this sort of, I like to think of it as a kind of fidelity in translating the information from the brain to the body. Okay, so we've now hopefully I've motivated you at least to consider the possibility that noetic feelings, there are at least a special kind of noetic feeling, one that is embodied in a very strong way, that communicates metacognitive information in a very loose sense of metacognitive, mnemonic information or computational processing information through bodily efference. And so now I'm going to say, now that you are motivated to buy into that, I'm now going to show you how this can help bridge the gap of metacognition. Okay, so the first thing that we need to do is we first need to make the case for strongly embodied noetic feelings as more complex than simple reinforcement signals. That's really important, because otherwise we fall prey to the problem triviality. And you might be thinking, well, we'll just make them domain general, in which case, great. I'm going to give you some evidence for why we think they are domain general. And the second thing that we need to do is we need to make a plausible case for how strongly embodied noetic feelings help make sense of mind reading, right? And that cultural origins hypothesis. So there's still these two components. So let's talk about noetic feelings as not being trivial. And I argue that they enable executive control, which is another way of saying that they are domain general, if you want. Another way of saying that they're conscious in like a access consciousness way, if you want. So here I'm going to argue quickly that strongly embodied noetic feelings enable executive functions. I appeal to the neurovisceral integration model, and that's based on looking at heart rate variability and how it's theorized in this model that heart rate variability is an index of the role that the body plays in enabling executive functioning. Okay, and so what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you that noetic feelings involve an increase in heart rate variability, which is empirical evidence to show that they involve enhanced levels of executive functions. So let's just quickly remind everybody that your heart is not a metronome, and the beats are quite different as time goes on. And heart rate variability is measuring the amount of variation in time between heartbeats. Greater HRV means more variation in between heartbeats, and less HRV means less variation, more like a metronome. And NVM describes this cardiac basal tone, which is indexed by HRV, to indicate a kind of functional integrity of neural networks implicated in emotion and cognition. And it's recently been updated in light of predictive coding architectures to describe this anatomical hierarchy with specific physiological processes that implement these bidirectional adaptive control nested loops of brain circuits and in multi-level neural network architecture. So I'll quickly just go over what that is here. So this is taken from Ryan Smith's paper. Here you can see there's 8 different levels. At the bottom, we have the heart and the intrinsic cardiac ganglia that controls coordinated intracardiac reactions. So this is sort of the heart brain, as it's sometimes called. And up here at the top of the network, you have the executive control network, which subserves conscious control of cognition and behavior. And of course, it can amplify or suppress cortical representations, and including those and the vagal hierarchy down below. And you can see here the typical sort of predictive coding, terminology of predictions and prediction errors flowing in opposite directions. And you can see, sure enough, that there are these loops going on between the executive control network and all the way down at the bottom, the heart. So when we couple NVM together with the Neo-Jamesian theory that I'm putting forward of noetic feelings, we get this proposal that indeed cardiorespiratory efferents can constitute strongly embodied noetic feelings, which will have the potential to shape and constrain information in the executive control network. So, you know, there's a model here for saying that these efferents can play these important roles. So concerning executive action, here's how NVM describes this as involving an increase in HRV. So for the executive control network to dominate action selection, the parasympathetic nervous system will have to inhibit sympathetic nervous system, right? And this will result in less metabolic demand, and so an increase in metabolic supply, and thus an increase in HRV. So So here's going back to the Kula lab and 2017 study that I cited earlier. We can see that noetic feelings are part of this process, enabling and facilitating executive control. We have some evidence here. The IBI. And with that information, you can get the HRV. You just need to do a root means square of successive differences. And what you end up getting is the HRV compared to old and new stimuli. So the old stimuli, right, that I'm highlighting now, this is when someone will report a feeling of familiarity. And we can calculate the HRV here. I've highlighted it in yellow, starting with stimulus onset. And we can compare the HRV for when they have a new stimulus. So there's no feeling of familiarity, right? And just looking at this graph, we can see really easily that there's greater slopes, right, with the old stimuli than there are with the new stimuli. And the difference is 0.5 milliseconds, which, as it turns out, is actually a lot, given that these are both executive actions, and that that feeling a noetic feeling actually causes an increase in heart rate acceleration, which generally lowers HRV. So we have an increase in HRV despite an increase in heart rate acceleration compared to another executive action. So there's really good evidence here to suggest that when you experience a noetic feeling, right, think about what you're doing. You're going, oh, I know that person. Oh, what is their name? You know, you're committing to all these executive functions to try and recover the name. And all of that is very much controlled from the top level of the hierarchy. And we have evidence here that this is indeed involving executive functions because of the relationship with HRV. Okay, so now I've hopefully made it clear to you that we have good reason to think that noetic feelings involve executive functioning, not just anecdotal experience or introspective evidence where I say, oh yeah, well, that's what it seems like to me when I have noetic feeling. We actually have empirical evidence related to the NVM model and HRV. Now I'm going to talk to you about how they might enable mind reading in the cultural origins hypothesis. I'm right at about 50 minutes, so I can do this in just a few minutes, mainly because this proposal is quite speculative as it hasn't been tested yet. So I don't have any empirical, and if anyone knows of any empirical evidence that might help me here, please do say something in the Q&A. But as far as I know, while doing my PhD thesis, I couldn't come across anything that concretely showed what I'm about to propose. And I'm happy to talk about ways that it could be tested empirically in the Q&A. So here's the proposal. So it involves appealing to two crucial features of embodied metacognition. So remember real quick that what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to bridge evaluative metacognition, right, the sort of control processing story, to the cultural origins hypothesis that we have mind reading as a result of our development, and it's developed throughout enculturation into adulthood. And so the first feature of embodied metacognition, there's two, right? The first is its propensity to produce these strongly embodied noetic feelings, which I've been arguing for the entire time. And what I want to say is the reason why they're so important is because of how emotional they are, how embodied they are. They're well suited to promote rich information-seeking behaviors. So think about how good it feels to arrive at a solution and how good it feels to be confident in decision-making. Think about how irritating confusion can be and the cognitive dissonance that's created by nonsense. Pleasant feelings in these strongly embodied ways, when we have them, they drive us to act on affordances, to explore them out, to put ourselves in similar situations, to feel them again. And unpleasant feelings, they motivate us to resolve unpleasant sensations in this emotionally satisfying way, right? You want to solve the problem because you want to solve the problem, but also because you want to take that unsatisfying, frustrating psychological state and replace it with a very satisfying one. And so by making them very emotional, making them very embodied, you're making it possible for people to engage in very robust epistemic foraging behaviors. This is a kind of intra-individual, within an individual regulation centered around confidence and uncertainty that can serve as an initial foundation for these key practices that will structure a collective epistemic agency. So the second feature is its propensity to produce these external manifestations of confidence. You can see it here in the image of the young girl raising her hand in class, and the other kids in the background, raising their hands in class. We've been enculturated to understand that this means that she's very confident and she knows the answer. But there are much more subtle bodily manifestations of confidence and uncertainty. And these behavioral expressions can be detected, monitored, regulated by other individuals in the sociocultural environment. And this gives way to an inter-individual, so among multiple individuals, form of regulation that can really sort of latch on to the cultural origins hypothesis. And it turns out that this is an effective form of regulation, I hypothesize, because of how confidence, when it's well placed, and it is well placed if it's coming from these predictive coding architectures that we've evolved to have, that confidence approximates competence, right? We know from politics that this is a very seductive way of looking at things, and it's not always true. But those are outliers, hopefully, and that the vast majority of us, when we're confident, it's because we're good at it. And these behaviors guided by noetic feelings then will approximate competent behaviors. And thus any species that learns to detect these behavioral expressions of confidence will gain a crucial evolutionary advantage in forms of cooperation. Good, okay, so now at the conclusion, what I have been trying to say is that inroads can be made in explaining the origin of self-knowledge by appealing to strongly embodied noetic feelings. When we appeal to emotion, we get a framework for making sense of robust psychological states that guide epistemic foraging behaviors. And we also get a framework for accounting for external manifestations of confidence uncertainty that can help bridge the phylogenetic origin story to the ontogenic origins or the cultural origins hypothesis about self-knowledge. Thank you for your attention.
Brilliant, thank you, John. Well, first of all, we should